tonight he's lecturing about the life and work of Addison Mizner, which is the big book that you see around here. It's a coffee table book. It came out about 1.5 years ago and was launched in Palm Beach, but we summer down there, and, sorry, winter down there and summer up here, so we wanted to do the lecture here too. Rene is a corporate executive for most of his career life, but after he retired, he took up writing, and he has written 5 books right now. Like I said, the third 3 I mentioned, and there's 2 others that are more about his own life. But I wanted to have him take over. He's a much better speaker than I am, and so go ahead, Rene.
Thank you, Robert. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. And Robert does all of this. He puts together the projector, he gets the food, he makes sure things work, and all I do is show up and talk. That's the easy part. So thank you, Robert. And thank you all for coming. I know that it's full season, it's a beautiful evening, there's lots of things you could be doing outside, and yet you've chosen to give me the next hour of your life to listen to what I have to say, and I'm appreciative of that. We're going to do things a little differently, as you kind of got the idea. We're not going to talk that much about the book. I'm not going to do any readings from the book. I'm going to try to weave a fabric for you, a tapestry from a fabric of the town that Addison Mizner had a huge impact over, which is Palm Beach. I will talk about this enigmatic, amazing gay socialite architect who in 7 years during the 1920s basically transformed Palm Beach, transformed and created something called the Palm Beach in the South Florida look. So we see here Worth Avenue as it was in 1924 when Addison Mizner opened his house and created, a few years before, had created the Everglades Club. And this was this street which had not been anything before and now had become this beautiful street, which is still revered around the world, one of the most famous shopping streets. Architecture, like all art, is a work of fiction, but it has to be believable. You have to put the right ingredients together in the right way, and Addison Mizner really knew how to do that. So I'm going to take a little step back, as I said I would, and talk about Palm Beach. Palm Beach was nothing but a barrier island with a lot of shrub on it, with a lot of mangrove bushes, until in 1878, when a Spanish ship called the Provincetown came aground just where Marjorie Merriweather's Post's house now is, and it became Palm Beach. And Palm Beach is a knuckle on the finger of Florida. It extends into the Gulf Stream more than any other part of Florida, so it enjoys the best climate in Florida. And the Provincetown was carrying a cargo of 20,000 coconuts. And these coconuts washed ashore, and some of the local people decided that they could get a new crop out of these coconuts. They planted them, and because of the wonderful climatic conditions, the biggest palm trees grew very quickly. The island really was not discovered up until the time of Henry Morrison Flagler. And Flagler came to Palm Beach by building his railroad and extending it to West Palm Beach, Florida in 1894 with a little spur of a wooden bridge that took people over across to the barrier island of Palm Beach. He built for his fourth wife as a wedding present. His wife was 40 years his junior, and he built her a beautiful wedding present, which is Whitehall, one of the magnificent homes to visit whenever you come to South Florida. But what he did was, immediately adjacent to Whitehall, he built the Royal Poinciana Hotel. And the Royal Poinciana Hotel, built in phases in the Georgian style from about 1894 to 1900, when extended, all of its wings were half a mile in length. It was the largest wood structure in America and one of the most glamorous and elegant hotels in America of the time. This was the ballroom of Whitehall, and the reason that this is so important, this slide, the picture of the ballroom, is that up until the time of this, there were no places in Palm Beach where society could gather. And then even after the Royal Poinciana was built, there was no place where society could gather other than here. because the houses that were there were really rather a series of simple houses. J.P. Morgan said of Flagler that he had the genius to see what Florida's wilderness and sand and underbrush was capable of becoming, and the nerve to build a railroad to get there. Having built that in that era was really quite remarkable. These are pictures, a picture of the hotel. And now I'm going to show you a little bit of Palm Beach. Palm Beach starts here at the north end, and then as it comes down here, this is the Breakers Hotel, the famous Breakers Hotel. Whitehall would have been back there. This area is called In Town. The Yacht Harbor, this must have been done in the summer because this yacht harbor is always overbooked. See the Everglades Club here, and then all of this stretch is called Millionaire's Mile, and then beyond here is called Billionaire's Mile. Before you get down to Mar-a-Lago, which is Donald Trump's place, which had been Marjorie Merriweather Post's magnificent home. Now let us look at Addison Mizner. Who was this man? He had a great sense of humor. He was charming. He could put his clients into a trance. And he had lots of funny things to say, including the fact that God gives us relatives, but thank God we can choose our own friends. In the words of Paris Singer, who was his friend, supporter, and financial backer, Mizner was too large, too talented, too unique to be bounded by any straight-laced morality, and he was not bound by any straight-laced morality. He's mostly known for having loved animals, parading around Palm Beach with his pet monkey Johnny Brown on his shoulder, often carrying one of his parrots, and that's how he looked. As he got bigger and bigger, he would take his shirts out of his pants, and he would hem them, and he created the sports shirt. When he was in Florida, it seemed like everything he touched would become an instant success. Frank Lloyd Wright, probably one of the greatest residential architects of all times, and not known for having given many compliments, said of Mizner that many architects had imagination, but only Addison Mizner had the courage to let it out of the cage. When Mizner was 15 years old, what he called the greatest day of his life was when his father had been appointed as ambassador to Guatemala, and he showed up in Guatemala, the family did. Mizner was 15. And he was suffering from a bad leg. He would suffer from a bad leg all of his life. And when he got to Guatemala, he saw buildings like this, 17th century Spanish architecture into Central America, and he fell in love with this look. And you will see these kinds of buildings repeated in all of the houses, the grand houses that he built. So he did not study to be an architect, but many of the famous architects of the period did not. They worked under a famous architect. And in 1894, Mizner went to work for Willis Jefferson Polk, who was a very respected San Francisco architect. And Mizner was told that he could experiment and draw California bungalows, which were all of the rage at the time. But he got bored with drawing bungalows. He will constantly be bored during his life and want to move on to new things. And he went off with two of his brothers to Alaska in 1897 in the search of great wealth and of gold. In spite of the fact that they did have a small find, his brother Wilson, who we'll talk about later, lost it in a gambling bet, and Mizner moved on to go around the world, and he started off in Hawaii, drawing what he called horrible charcoal drawings, like this one. But they couldn't have been so horrible because he earned enough money to carry on and to continue his travels, and he ended up in Australia, where in spite of his bad leg, he became an amateur boxer. So this is a man who had all sorts of strange things in his life, until he got to New York in 1902, and he met this man, Sanford White, a great architect of the period, who was just finishing up Rosecliff in Newport, one of the nice magnificent mansions there for the Ehrlich Fair sisters. And Sanford White put him to work on this project and on a few other projects, but as a draftsman in the back. And Addison said of White, "I worshipped him. For me, he was my God." Mizner had a symbiotic relationship with his younger brother, Wilson. And Wilson will be a very, very bad influence on this man over the decades. But Wilson was also a bon vivant. They had some things in common, and they were diametrically opposed on others. Wilson was a ladies' man. Mizner was not. Wilson was fun-loving and happy, and people tended to like him on first sight, as Mizner was. And Wilson, who was a bit of a playwright, with some element of success, said that if you steal from one author, it's plagiarism, but if you steal from many, it's research. He had tons of fun things like that to say, including be nice to people on your way up because you'll meet them on your way down. Their relationship was so interesting that Stephen Sondheim wrote 2 plays about it. They're basically very similar, Bounce in 2003 and Roadshow in 2004. Mizner really had nothing but failures, as I have pointed out, until he met this man, Paris Singer. Paris Singer was the 22nd of 24 children of Isaac Singer, who invented the sewing machine. But because of who his mother was and circumstances of his father's death, he inherited the vast part of the Singer sewing machine fortune. And when Mizner met him in 1917, he said that Singer had become the cause of his existence for the next 10 years. This was during the First World War, and as many of the very wealthy people of that era did, Singer had given some of his houses to become convalescent homes for World War I returning veterans. If you have seen Downton Abbey, you see that Downton Abbey was transformed into that one of those. He had given his home in England in Paddington to become one of those, and he had a beautiful home outside of Paris, which he had given to his girlfriend Isadora Duncan to make into a dance studio. They together decided that they would bring it back to become a convalescent hospital. Why is this important? You'll see that when Addison, so Paris Singer says to Mizner, let's go to this new town of Palm Beach. Maybe we can create a convalescent hospital there so that we can have an impact around here. And they went down to Palm Beach, where Singer had a bungalow on Peruvian Avenue. And Mizner said from his memoir, as I looked around Peruvian Avenue, all I saw were other atrocities similar to the one we were in. And he started to complain about the fact that there was no decent architecture in this town, which was just becoming quite social. He looked around the neighborhood, and he said that, like other neighborhoods, the land had been raped of all of its natural beauty. So Singer says to him, let's walk about a quarter of a mile from here, and let's look at a site, a plot of land, where maybe we could produce this convalescent hospital. And when Mizner saw it, he said, it is so beautiful that it ought to be something religious, with a chapel built out there into the lake, with great cool cloisters and a court of oranges, a great gate over there on the road where the faithful could leave their offerings and receive largesse. What a spot. And this is what he was looking at. He was looking at Joe's Alligator Farm, which was just a marsh, a mangrove marsh. It was one of the only places in Palm Beach where people from the Royal Poinciana could come to see a show, and the show that they saw was Joe wrestling his alligators. They bought that whole end of what is now Worth Avenue and the whole beginning of the Intercoastal along there, and in 9 months, Mizner built this, which was absolutely unbelievable to hear about. 9 months he built the Everglades Club. It's documented. People think I'm inventing that, but I'm not. And while he was building that, the war came to an abrupt end. So it never became a hospital. They transformed it and said, what are we going to do with this thing? And they said, well, the Royal Poinciana is kind of Edwardian and rather boring. Let's build our own club. We'll start all sorts of things happening here. And he opened it in 1919. And while he was building it, he had so much fun. These quotes are from his memoir. Nowhere could I get tilled, so he had them made. He had to build a tree moving machine. What fun it was teaching men how to stucco, teaching others how to cure pip and chickens. He was a jack of all trades, not like the architects du jour, who were rather stodgy, who came to meetings in stiff collar shirts. Mizner did everything himself, loved teaching people how to do all of the trades. And this was the Everglades Club on opening night in February 1919, the dining room. And these are the rooms of today. It looks very much the same as it did in 1919. It became the place where anybody who wanted to be blue-blooded in Palm Beach had to become a member. And here we see, like, the Kennedys with their very young daughter-in-law. Paris Singer carved out a great part of the Everglades Club for his own apartment, which still exists on the top floor. If you have a little bit of extra cash, you can rent it this winter for $100,000 a month. That's the living room of the apartment. And so that's the Everglades Club today. That would be Singer's apartment, and this, of course, is Worth Avenue. While he was building this, Paris Singer became totally enthralled with how this man could put together something and be the jack of all trades. He said that Addison is like the architects of the Middle Ages. He paints, carves wood, and works in metals, knows all about making glazed pottery, and his wrought iron is second to none in old Spain. And he said to Mizner, basically, whatever you want to do, I will support you. I'll support you enthusiastically. At the opening of the Everglades Club, Addison Mizner meets Ava Stotesbury. And Ava Stotesbury was sort of the Archduchess of Palm Beach at the time. Before Marjorie Merriweather Post, this was the woman. And they had stayed at the Royal Poinciana Hotel. She and her husband had stayed there for several winters, and they decided they were going to build a mega home, the first one of its kind, in Palm Beach. She was working on the plans with her architect from Pennsylvania, and she fell in love with the Everglades Club. She grabbed Mizner on opening night, and she said, Mr. Mizner, would you consider building something like that, looks a little bit like this, that feels like this, as my home? And he said, of course. She said, do you think you can have it in less than 4 years, which is what Horace Tumbauer has told me? And he said, I'll have it for you next season. They became incredibly close. He called her Queen Eva, and since she was so popular, so sought after, other women of high society wanted to do what she wanted to do. And once she finished this magnificent El Mirasol estate, here a beginning of pictures of it, everybody wanted to have something somewhat similar and to look for this great new architect, Addison Mizner. We'll see here parts of El Mirasol, very reminiscent of what I showed you from the Everglades Club, the first indoor swimming pool, and it had 40 acres. And she had a pet, little zoo on it, and she would invite all of the children from the island to come and see the animals, to have picnics on the estate. And this was very different from the kind of society and the kind of things that the Edwardian Society did at the Royal Poinciana. So Ava Stotesbury, and in my opinion Addison Mizner, had this big effect on the way Palm Beach thinks. These were just her other home, White Marsh Hall, by Tumbauer in the Neo-Georgian style, and her lovely home in Bar Harbor in neo-colonial style. These three homes have all been destroyed. And this was the auction for some of her things when the house was about to be destroyed in 1954. This is all that remains, which is a gate, one of the gates to the estate. And people who built that house have very cleverly used it sort of as a front door, a grand front door. If there ever was a case for preservation, look at this slide. This is El Mirasol in 1923, and this is that same, from the same angle, the same piece of property in 1991 what happened. These magnificent homes were all torn down. So the contender to be Queen of Palm Beach in that period was a lady by the name of Eleanor Cusden. She was a young beauty. She had married this man who was a good bit older than she. It is believed that the Great Gatsby was a little bit fashioned after him. He had gone from rags to riches. He had worked in a pharmacy as a clerk and had become a multimillionaire with his oil company, the Mid-Continent oil refinery stations, which were all over Oklahoma. Became one of the wealthiest men in America very quickly. And they built Playa Riente the year after El Mirasol's, Mrs. Stotesbury's El Mirasol. And people think that all of Mizner's homes look alike. They really don't. This is Italianate in style. El Mirasol is much more Spanish in style. They're quite different. And these were the grand rooms, the dining room, and the front hall of Playa Riente. The Custons went from rags to riches, as I said, and they went back to rags. He lost all of his money, and Anna Dodge bought Playa Riente and lived there for many years until her death as a very old lady. And these were some of Anna Dodge's other homes and some of her toys, yacht that she used to keep in the Mediterranean. So I've spoken about two beautiful homes that have been destroyed. I decided to throw in a house that has managed to survive. And it was built by Colonel Barclay and Mary Warburton. And it was just adjacent to what had been the Alligator Farm, and it's very close to the Everglades Club. And Barclay Warburton was a publisher, a newspaper publisher from Philadelphia. And the Wanamaker's were a big family in Philadelphia. Together, they created quite a little empire. And their friends started building houses all over Palm Beach as well. And they built this magnificent home here, Villa des Cygnes Swan House, which is this whole area. And this whole zone had belonged to a friend of Warburton's. And he said, look, please come down to Palm Beach. I've had Mizner build my house. He'll build you one right next door. And so the Everglades Club is over here. That's Worth Avenue. And this is the zone that had been that big marsh. This house, this magnificent house, was owned first by the Warburtons, who had a nice 30-year run there until their death, a month apart from each other. It then went to Sue Whitmore, who was the Listerine queen, had inherited the Listerine fortune. And she bought it in '55 when a lot of the big, beautiful homes were being torn down. And so people thought, oh my goodness, this is wonderful. This woman has all the money in the world. She's going to maintain that house and she's going to live in it. But actually, what she didn't. The area became, she never took possession. She never decided to live there. The area became known as Sioux City. The house was chopped into 3 different buildings. There were 10 apartments in it, and it was really quite a mess until this lady, Catherine McFarland Ross, bought it in 1986 and renovated it and somewhat saved it. But in 2010, it went to, it was bought by Nick and Dee Adams, and they have restored it to an absolute magnificence right now. This was the living room in '24, the living room under Kathleen McFarland. And this is the house now, just finishing a $25 million reconstruction and remodeling. All of these homes that Mizner built didn't have very good foundations. He threw them up very quickly, as I told you. They didn't have the technology then to anchor some of these homes into the rock under the sand. So a lot of them sat on sand. And many of the first homes just started to fall apart and sink down into the sand. This house was one of the ones, the big mansions that are being bought now, the vast majority of them have to be picked up, have to have anchors put down into the rock under the sand, and the houses put back on them. It takes a couple of years, and it costs a score of $1 million just to do that. They probably spent at least $12 million just getting it secure. But these homes, not just this one, but the homes that are being saved, are mostly being done like that, to the point that if there was a terrible hurricane and that whole end of the island was wiped away, I can assure you, this house would just be sitting on stilts into the rock, as well as most of its property. This was just at the end of the renovation. The plantings have not been done. The pool is in. Magnificent swan motifs everywhere on the property. So, now we're going to talk about Mizner's own house, Villa Mizner, which is the subject of my book. We have here Worth Avenue. So after the Everglades Club and after some of these homes that were being built, Singer and Mizner decided that they really should build a community. They were having an impact on the way Palm Beach thought. It was becoming much more socially inclusive and a little bit more liberal. And they thought they would create a pedestrian village on this end of Worth Avenue that would connect Worth Avenue to the adjoining street of Peruvian Avenue. And there would be these meandering walkways in an old European style, which would have storefronts on the ground floor and apartments on upstairs, some offices and some restaurants. So they created the famous villas around here. But Mizner had wanted to build his own house. And this was actually the fourth house that he built and the first house that he was able to live in, because every time he would build one of his beautiful homes on the ocean or on the intercoastal, one of his clients would want it, and he would sell it either as he was moving in or just before he moved in. So he decided he would build this pedestrian town that he and Singer had been talking about, and in it he would have like a Roman in-town hidden palace, which was going to be this magnificent, as all of this. But as I said, he built this was his fourth house. Let's look at the houses that he built for himself before. The first one he built is called El Solano. It still exists. It was bought by his friend Harold Vanderbilt. And it was the first house in Palm Beach to be landmarked. There was no landmarking until 1979. Nobody was remotely interested in protecting magnificent old homes. And most of the homes were torn down, as I mentioned. This one, in 1979, 20 homes were proposed to the Palm Beach Landmarks Commission for landmarking. 19 of those homeowners lawyered up and fought it tooth and nail, and the only one who didn't was the owner of this house, and it was John Lennon, the Beatle, who owned it just for a couple of years until he was killed. He enthusiastically supported the concept of landmarking. This was the first house to be landmarked in Palm Beach. Mizner then built Concha Marina, which was Mrs. Trump's house for a while, and has now been bought and is being secured in the way that I described Villa des Cines secured. It went to George Sloan, so he built a third house called Sin Ciudado, meaning beyond the city, and it was a little further south, and he hoped that maybe it was south enough that nobody would want it. But no, Edward Moore decided that he wanted the house and paid whatever he could. See, Mizner was always in financial trouble. So when people would come by with a pile of money to buy this house, he was very happy to move on. He lived an extravagant life beyond his means. His brother always sucked him dry of everything he could get. Mizner was always in financial trouble. Interesting, this house has been de-landmarked or unlandmarked. The reason is that I'm on the Landmarks Commission in Palm Beach, and the reason is that if more than 50% of a house has been altered from its original landmarking theories of the architect, then it is no longer valid and it's unlandmarked. So the owners, when Mizner built his Villa Mizner, these were the owners of the property. Of course, he owned it from 1924 until 1933, when he died in it. It then went to a very wealthy fellow from New York who had married a young woman who had a son out of wedlock. She was Jewish. There was a lot of contention about this marriage in New York, and he took his money and he went to Palm Beach, and he decided that they were going to start a new life as a very young couple, and he bought the villas and the Villa Mizner, which is in Villa Mizner. At the time of Mizner's death, he owned, even though it was in bankruptcy, he had owned that whole zone, including not just the house, but also the villa. The Sachs lived there, had a 40-year run there, where they owned and managed all of these properties in the villas. They owned 100 rental properties. It was quite a little real estate empire. I took this picture of Rose Sachs on her 100th birthday in 2012. She died a couple of months ago at 103. And Robert and I were at her 103rd birthday about 2 weeks before she died, and she was having a grand time. They had a wonderful run there, and when Mortimer died, she left it and sold it to Robert and Gay Knuth, very glamorous couple, who were the first ones to split the villa apart from the villas. The villas are now a series of condominiums, and the villa is a standalone. It was a very glamorous couple who wanted to become members of the Everglades Club. None of the other members, the Saxes had not been approved as members of the Everglades Club. The Everglades Club, which is right across the street from the villa, is a very exclusive club, and I say that in the worst sense of the word exclusive. To this date, there are no Jews, there are certainly no blacks. There's just none of us. I don't think any of us qualify. No known gay people. So it is just a very repressive club these days. They did not approve the previous owners, and they were about to approve the Canoes when they had a big fight one night, and he threw all of her clothes out of the window onto Worth Avenue, which was not exactly what the Credentials Commission of the Everglades Club was looking for, so they weren't approved either. And neither have these people been, who are the current owners, Nick and Dee Adams, who have restored the place beautifully. To prove that point, this is Mizner's living room in 1924. Now this is a townhouse. This is a house that's right smack in the middle of the Villas. This was the living room in 1924, and this is the living room today. Even though under the Saxes it had a very 50s and 60s look, under the Canoes it had an 80s look, they completely restored the villa so that, as they say, it looks like Mizner just stepped out to dinner. This was his dining room then, his dining room now. This paneling is from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella's castle in Salamanca. That's verifiable. What's not verifiable is what Mizner claimed, which was that it had been a gift to him from King Alfonso XIII. And is that room side by side. So I mentioned King Alfonso XIII, but here's the villas. This is Via Parigi, walking down towards Via Mizner. And you'll get a feeling for the charming shops that are on the ground floor, cute little apartments on the upstairs, up above. Also a couple of restaurants in there. Coming out of Via Parigi and turning towards looking at famous Renato's restaurant and going into Via Mizner. So Mizner, by the end of 1925, when the Villas opened, he owned Mizner Architects, he owned Mizner Industries next door, which made most of the furniture that went into the house. If the furniture wasn't imported by his clients from Europe, he could build replicas, and he built tons and tons of antique replicas. In the summers, what he would do is, with Mrs. Cusden and with Mrs. Stotesbury and the Phippses and a few others, they would all go on these huge buying sprees to Europe. And they would buy everything in sight, from fabrics to pillars to walls to furniture to woodwork, everything. And one of the clients, Mrs. Phipps, had been a Grace, and there was a Grace shipping line which belonged to her, and she would send some freighters over, and the freighters would bring back tons and tons of things that they bought all around the Mediterranean and put into all these magnificent homes. If one of his clients didn't have those, Mizner Industries would create copies. So he had the architectural firm, the industrial side, and then he and Singer decided that the villas and the little village that they had created was so successful that they were going to create a whole town. And they created something, they founded something called the Mizner Development Corporation, which bought and built what is currently Boca Raton. The idea of Boca Raton was that it was going to be a model city, everything absolutely perfect, built in the Venetian style. This was the plan for El Camino Real, which was going to have a canal down the center of it. And they bought this whole zone over here, the Intercoastal and this whole area, which was an unincorporated area called Boca Raton, in 2 words. And the reason that they selected this area, which is 28 miles south of Palm Beach, is that its topography is very, very similar to Palm Beach. It opens up, the Intercoastal opens up into a lake, just like it does in Palm Beach, where the Intercoastal opens up into Lake Worth. And there's an inlet, which is really important for the clients to get their big boats in and out. And so they loved this area, it was close enough, they bought the whole thing, and they started the development of Boca Raton. And of course, this is what we know of Boca Raton today. That's the lake, and this is the end of one of the Intercoastal into it. And they decided that it was going to be a cosmopolitan world community destined to be the world's most architecturally beautiful playground. Everything in it was going to be designed and built by Mizner. They started off planning 2 hotels, the Cloister Inn, 1925, which became the current Boca Raton Resort and Club. This was to be the smaller of the 2 hotels. The larger hotel was going to be on A1A, and it was never built. But this, of course, is the Boca Raton Hotel today. This part is what Mizner did. And of course now, even all of this is just a fraction of that site of apartments and conference centers and other wings to the hotels. The larger hotel was to be the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and it was going to be grander and bigger. It was going to have an airstrip. It was going to have a harbor that would be deep enough for Mrs. Post to get her boat into, which she could not get into at Palm Beach. Couldn't get into the harbor at Palm Beach. Again, Camino Real. And he was going to have in the middle of the lake something called Mizner Castle. This whole project had really gone to their heads, to the heads of Wilson and Addison, and they became a little bit too extravagant. This idea of Mizner Castle with a moat in the middle of the lake was a little bit over the top. Again, they designed all the buildings to make it a model city, and a few of them were built. For example, this town hall, first it was the town hall, now the Historical Society was built. But what happened was that the Mizner Development Corporation was founded in 1925, and in 1926 things started to fall apart in Florida. Florida had enjoyed the biggest boom in history, but there was a real estate bust in 26. 26 also saw a bad hurricane, the Great Miami Hurricane. Not one Mizner house was hurt, but most of those bungalows, many of those bungalows you saw were destroyed. Then came the banking collapse in 1927, and in 28 this horrible hurricane with 4,000 dead, which really flattened that whole area, and the Great Depression in 29. So Mizner Development Corporation went out of business. Now, this was its board of directors. We have Harold Vanderbilt, James Ketchum Vanderbilt, Clarence Geist, Senator DuPont, Irving Berlin, the Duchess of Sutherland, and Elizabeth Arden. This was a very, very powerful board of directors. And they had the ability to withstand all of those things that took place in 26, 27, and 28. And they would have stood by Mizner, who would have ended up in charge of Boca Raton, were it not for Wilson. And Wilson was just going more and more berserk in his grand lifestyle, it became known that to the board, and the boards told Mizner that he had to sort of pull this guy in. He was a loose cannon, and Mizner stood by his brother, and they basically threw him out. The times were difficult; they threw him out, and in 1927, the Mizner Development Corporation went bankrupt after only 2 years in existence. And on that same day of April 30th, his pet monkey, Johnny Brown, died, the day that the Mizner Development Corporation was served with its bankruptcy papers. And Mizner was in one of the restaurants in Palm Beach that night crying, and they said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "I'm crying because Johnny Brown died," which is much more important to him than losing the Mizner Development Corporation. He was a happy-go-lucky person. He'd gone up and down all of his life. And again, after only 7 years of great success in Palm Beach, where he built 38 mansions in 7 years and was the talk and the toast of the town, he was basically penniless. The next year, and he had no more work. People weren't giving him work. There weren't many draftsmen left in his office. There was one associate architect, whereas he had previously had a whole floor full of them. And his friend Harold Vanderbilt bought this section of the center of Palm Beach and gave the money to create a memorial park and a fountain, which Mizner designed. But he had very few clients, very few commissions after the bankruptcy of the Mizner Development Corporation. Mizner Memorial Park is now being renovated and updated. This is a rendering of how it's going to look. And so he was allowed to live in the villa. Some of his very wealthy clients would come by and give his private secretary, Mrs. Calloway, nice big checks. Some of them were $10,000, which was a huge amount of money in those days. And they would say, Harold Vanderbilt said this, and a few of the others, Moore, Edward Moore, just pay off the most important bills, keep him comfortable, pretend things are still functioning, and just use this and we'll come by again and when you need some more money. And that's how he was able to stay in the villa. And so in late 1932, he decided he wanted to go and see his brother and celebrate his 60th birthday with his brother in California, Wilson. Wilson had left Palm Beach a few years before when the money had stopped flowing. And Mizner, who was suffering from a heart condition and a bad leg, and he was overweight, he got into a car which was in those days not air conditioned, certainly not heated well, and he headed out on the trek from Palm Beach to San Francisco, to Los Angeles. And as you can tell from the way I'm saying it, it didn't go too well. He showed up at the Ambassador Hotel where his brother was living, and upon arrival he collapsed in the lobby and was taken to a hospital where he had had a heart attack, and they were told his condition was rather serious. And he and Wilson, he had bought Wilson a share in the Brown Derby restaurant. And Wilson used to sit there every night in the window, and he invented something which was a one-way glass. Whenever creditors were coming by, they couldn't see him, but if they did come in, he'd run into the bathroom and hide. And Mizner and he ate, when Mizner got out of the hospital, ate in that table until Mizner decided he was going to go to Mineral Springs in Texas to take the baths, and on his way back to Florida. And he asked his brother to join him, and his brother said no, he was writing a new play. And in Mineral Springs, Mizner collapsed again. They wouldn't give him the water, he was too weak, but he got in his own car and he drove back to Florida. And on February 5th, he asked his last remaining servant, Medina, who was a wonderful, loyal servant to him, to bring him up to his office, which was on the top floor. And he wanted his bed propped up so that he could see the sunset. And just as the sun was setting on February 5th, 1933, he died. This is the foyer of the house. It's exactly as it is now. He had asked that there not be a funeral or a service, and yet 1,000 people showed up in the villa and at the villa and they did have, in fact, a little service. He wanted to be cremated and buried in California in an unmarked grave. 1 month after he died, his brother Wilson died, and is also buried next to him in an unmarked grave in Benicio, California. So you've seen a little bit about Mizner, the pensive man, the fun-loving party guy, a little bit of an eccentric, of course. We saw him with his animals, and he was just a charming, wonderful person who entertained his clients. They loved working with him. The meetings that they had with other architects were very stuffy. With him, it was a lot of fun. They absolutely loved him, and we see Addison Mizner there. And the book that I wrote is about his house and how he and the people who have subsequently owned it have had an impact on Palm Beach. It's called Villa Mizner, the house that changed Palm Beach, and it is around if you want to have a look at it or a copy of it. This is Worth Avenue, a rendering of Worth Avenue, and I'll leave you with a picture of the new renovation of Worth Avenue that's just been completed. So thank you very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. That's the end. Do you have questions?
Yes, I do.
Yes, Mom.
Was Wilson bipolar?
Well, I wish you had been around at the time to diagnose it, but quite possibly. He certainly behaved that way. He had great ups and downs. I think he was definitely a pathological liar, probably a sociopath, from what I've read about Wilson's life. Whether he may have been bipolar also. Certainly there were no medications at the time to help with that.
And
Do you ask that because you heard something or have a suspicion?
No, but his actions seemed to be bipolar.
He had married a woman who was 25 years older than he, and she had a lovely art collection, and he basically stole the art collection and tried to sell it, put reproductions in the room until she realized what was going on. And then he was badly beaten and put in jail, probably in a drug deal. And that's when Mizner said to him, we're setting up here in Palm Beach, why don't you come down? So he had, Wilson brought him to Alaska, which was a fiasco, and everywhere Mizner went, Wilson eventually came and also helped bring him down. But Mizner loved him. Mizner, even though he died without work and without any money and without any clients, he wasn't miserable because of that. This was a man who had great the ability to spring back, great resilience. And he was a bon vivant who did not attach any value to money or the fame that he was amassing. Yes?
What is the evidence that Mizner was gay?
Great question. Well, he was gay in a 1920s way, which was, he felt that he was able to be flamboyant. He certainly was very flamboyant in his mannerisms, but he wasn't out as most of the people in the 1920s were not out. However, all of his women friends knew he was. He used lots of innuendos in his speech and in his jokes with these women who would laugh and they'd love it. He said that, what's the expression about the bricklayer? I don't know, I lay bricks as well as any bricklayer I've ever had. He made all sorts of little jokes about it, and then his favorite draftsman would always be invited to leave the dormitory which was above Mizner Industries and come and stay in the villa with him. So he often had a different young, one at a time. I guess he went through his draftsman one at a time. And the only permanent, long-lasting relationship that he had was with a young British antique dealer. And he never came to Palm Beach, but during the 3 months of the summer when they'd go on these big buying sprees throughout Europe, this Colin used to come and stay with Mizner on these buying trips. And all the women loved him, received him, but he never came back to Palm Beach. So he didn't have a permanent boyfriend in Palm Beach, but he had these little trysts with his draftsman. Yes?
How many of Mizner's creations are still preserved?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you for asking that. He built 38 mansions in Palm Beach, and 20 exist. There are still 20 of those 38.
And how many of those are still mostly preserved in the same manner that he built them?
Yes. A lot of them had fallen into states of disrepair over the years. But right now, because of the enormous wealth that's poured into Palm Beach, they've been bought up because they are all landmarked. They have to be, they can't just be torn down, they can't be modified in a way that his genius would be lost. So the answer to that is yes, it's a great question, thank you. Let me tell you why, another question that I often get, and I did not explain it properly perhaps, is why were these houses torn down in the 50s and 60s? And the answer is that the families that owned those houses, the very wealthy families that owned those houses by the 50s and 60s, they didn't want to live in a way that had been consistent with the way these houses had to be managed when they were built in the 1920s and 1930s. They had 40 servants, 45 servants in some of these houses to run them. And the super wealthy in the 50s and 60s didn't really want to live that way. The houses were also at a point where they would have to be updated, the kitchens and the bathrooms. Mizner was never really good at the bathrooms. He always said he left that to his plumbers. He was much more concerned with the layouts. The bathrooms were always the weak links in his houses. Of course, they weren't air conditioned. He was a brilliant planner for ventilation. His houses were much better ventilated than any of the other traditional architects. The main rooms had windows on 3 sides. All the rooms had windows on 2 sides. He thought where the prevailing winds would be blowing from and how to get the odors out of the house. But still, by the 50s and 60s, they would have had to have been air conditioned. And that was a difficult job. The bathrooms would have had to have been redone completely. And most importantly, these families didn't want to live with 40 servants. And that's when a lot of them were torn down. Today, with the hedge fund people and I call them squillionaires, not even billionaires, they're beyond the billionaires. When the squillionaires come to Palm Beach, they don't care what it's going to cost to run these houses. They want a great, big, beautiful Mizner. Now, there were other architects that came in the 30s and the 40s that were really good architects. Wyeth is a great one, Fascio is a good one, Major. There were a number of good architects that came to Palm Beach to build other magnificent homes. But Mizner really jump-started the whole thing. Anything else? Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a treat.